My name is Ann Wilmuth. I'm one of the children's librarians here at the Iowa City Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you all and thank you all so much for being here tonight. Thank you also to our co-sponsor, the Iowa City UNESCO City of Literature. On your chairs, when you came in, you found a very brief survey on a half sheet of paper. I'd like to invite you to fill this out at some point this evening and drop it in the basket next to the door on your way out. There are pens or pencils at the end of each row if you'd be willing to share those along the row. Our library director actually suggested that we do this survey tonight because there was such amazing high interest in this program, and we thought it might be a good opportunity to collect some data from our community on what topics feel most urgent to you that we could use to explore planning whole series of events around. So thank you so much for being willing to briefly fill these out. We do want to use it to drive programming that aligns with our community interest. Also, we are live streaming this talk in the Storytime room in the children's department, so if you need more space or have small children with you who might do better in that setting, you're welcome to move to that space at any time as well. Now, it is my pleasure tonight to introduce the Reverend Dr. Jennifer Harvey. Dr. Harvey is a writer, speaker, and professor of religion at Drake University in Des Moines. She holds a PhD in Christian ethics from Union Theological Seminary in New York, and her work focuses primarily on racial justice and white anti-racism. Dr. Harvey's most recent books include Raising White Kids, Bringing Up Children in a Racially Unjust America, and Dear White Christians, for those still longing for racial reconciliation. Copies of Dr. Harvey's books will be available for purchase and for her to sign following tonight's program. Dr. Harvey has contributed to the New York Times, CNN, and has been a guest on both Iowa and National Public Radio. She is a widely sought-after public speaker and is ordained in the American Baptist Churches USA. Please help me welcome Dr. Jennifer Harvey.
Thank you so much, Anne. I'm so grateful for the invitation to come to Iowa City tonight, and public libraries are the best, and the staff at public libraries are the best, so thank you so much for inviting and for all the hospitality, and you all for turning out in this public library space to be in dialogue together. So I'm really happy to be here. I'm going to dive in by, my hope tonight is to share a bunch of stories with you that help, I think, identify some of the landscape that we need to find our footing on more fully if we would like a different future than we are currently experiencing in this moment. And I think if you're in this space, you probably are longing for something different in the future than we know today. So I'm going to just dive in with the story number one, which is an actual story that a Des Moines public school teacher shared with me a few years ago. And this Des Moines public school teacher was also a parent. And she said this to me. She said, "I was so relieved when my second grader came home after her school's Martin Luther King Jr. celebration. I'd worried about what she'd be taught, like I figured they might sugarcoat things. But when she came home, my daughter was so excited about everything she'd learned, and her school had done a great job. But then, after sharing all she'd learned, my daughter turned to me and she said, 'You know what, Mom? I'm so glad we're white.'" Yeah. And I thought, oh my God, do we say that? So let's imagine this child had been Latina, and she had come home after a day of celebrating a Latina justice leader, and she had said, "Mom, I'm so glad we're Latinas." I don't think her mother's first response would have been an angst-ridden, like, oh my gosh, oh no. And very likely, black children in that actual second grade class did go home that day and say things like, "Dad, I'm so glad we're black." To which I can imagine many a father saying, "Indeed, we are glad we're black." But the racial landscape is just fundamentally different for white children and for parents of white children. And the difference is this. If you are committed to equity, if you believe in justice, but you live in an unjust society that also privileges you in that injustice, you face some very real conundrums. Conundrums that show up in a moment like, "I'm so glad we're white." Oh my God, do we say that? So these conundrums impact white children's development from their very earliest days. Now, we also need to know, of course, that race impacts all children's development. And all of our children need support to navigate a society that is both robustly diverse, but also deeply unjust. But we also know from many, many studies that parents of children of color tend to offer that support. So we know, for example, that parents of kids of color teach their children explicitly about the ways that race matters in their lives at rates 2 to 5 times higher than do white parents or parents of white children. And in contrast, we also know that 75% of white families with kindergartners self-report as never or almost never talking about race with theirs. That is a lot of white silence. It's a lot of white silence. And so what I want to talk about with you all this evening is what white silence looks like, why it is so very dangerous, what it yields, and then most importantly, I want to talk a little bit about what some of the counter responses might be that I think we need to develop collectively. I want to start by asking, on my way to another story, how many of you saw about 2.5 years ago, I think it was spring of 2017 maybe, the story about the 2 4-year-old boys who were best friends. One was white, one was black. Some of you are nodding. So these 2 4-year-olds had this beautiful friendship. They decided to get matching haircuts so that they could see if they could trick their teacher, see if she could tell them apart. Yes, okay. The story got tons of media attention. It actually made it on the actual television, not only on social media. And I think that was partly because the friendship was really beautiful and sweet, and I think it kind of tapped into a longing some of us have for a different kind of possibility in terms of interracial relationships. But I also quickly became clear that it was getting so much attention because it seemed to be evidence that white silence is a good parenting strategy. So it seemed to be proof that A, kids can be taught not to see color, and B, that when they can, that that's a win. I actually heard the white boy's mom tell a journalist that his, quote, inability to see a difference was a parental success because, she said, quote, I just taught him to love everyone the same. So those words sound really nice, but we know, of course, this is a version of so-called colorblind teaching, which is actually would be better served, we'd all be better served if we started calling it what it really is, which is white silence. It's not colorblind teaching, it's white silence. Families of color do not adopt colorblind approaches to parenting. It's a white thing, so we should call it that. Here's another version of white silence from a different mom. This mom said this to me: I've always taught my children to treat everyone with kindness, and they have friends of lots of different races and from different cultures. They never cared what race someone was until they came home after Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Martin Luther King Jr. Day gives white families fits in the United States. It really does. And if we can't figure that out, we're in a lot of trouble. So suddenly, she says, they were talking about people's race all the time, and they'd say things like this: our friend Joe, he's black, right? And I really don't think it's good for them to focus on people's race and put them in boxes. Isn't that the opposite of what we should be trying to do? Okay, so this mom values diversity. She thinks it's good that her kids have, quote, friends of lots of different races. She's not, negative or opposed to that. But she's afraid that teaching kids to notice race is going to backfire. And the thing is, it might. There are actual conundrums that do pop up here. Like, what does it mean to say that Joe is black? Does Joe identify that way? And what are her kids assuming they might know about Joe because he's black? And isn't making assumptions about anyone because of their race exactly what we learned not to do in the civil rights movement? And obviously it's a problem if children, especially white children, run around pointing and labeling other people's children, right? That's not the goal here. But the thing is, even if there's some risks, because the word conundrum is just throughout this entire landscape, things will backfire much worse if this mom succumbs to the temptation to do white silence in the hopes of avoiding those real conundrums. If she defaults to generic teachings like equality, or we just love everyone the same, or underneath our skin, we're all just human, we all bleed red blood, we know that if she defaults to those kinds of teachings because of her own discomfort about the conundrums that pop up, that it's going to backfire, because there was another study done of about 100 white families, I believe it was, in 2006. And these were families that said their approach to race was to teach their kids that everybody's equal. And so researchers sat with those families, and then at one point they sat with the kids, and they took the kids, the parents were not in the room, and researchers asked the children in this study a very blunt question. And the question was, do your parents like black people? And 38% of the kids being raised in these everybody's equal families said, I don't know. And 14% of those white kids being raised in those kind of families said, nope, nope, my parents don't like black people. Turns out we're all equal is literally so abstract, kids have no idea what it means. They don't know that they're supposed to connect that to actually valuing people, whatever and through all of our skin colors, hair textures, accents, names. Most troubling is that that way of teaching children about race literally does nothing to counteract racism in children's development. So there's a final type of silence I want to just mention in passing, because white silence can actually take a bunch of forms, and sometimes it's a little bit hard to notice that that's really what's going on. And that is the silence that can actually be very pervasive, even in spaces where we are talking about valuing diversity, which I think we're doing more and more in lots of educational contexts. Valuing diversity can also be a form of white silence for this reason. There is simply a fundamental difference between living in a diverse society and living in a white racial hierarchy. If we lived in a diverse society that was also fair, then we could just value difference, and that would be great. We could say to kids, we're all different, let's celebrate, and we could go on our merry way. But that's not where we live. The reality is we are not all just different. The reality is some children receive benefits and protections and access, while some children do not. And so diversity gets us much closer to talking about race. It's certainly improvement over colorblind forms of white silence, but it doesn't necessarily engage racism. And if we don't explicitly engage children with racism, we can't possibly make anti-racism part of the scope of their moral imagination. They can't learn to do anti-racism or think about anti-racism if they don't even ever learn about racism. So diversity can be a form of white silence as well. So before I talk about some of the dangers of white silence, what it can yield, I want to say that this is not just a parenting problem. There are a lot of adults who are involved when it comes to raising kids. Actually, any adult who's ever had a kid in their peripheral vision who has also seen them is helping to raise that child. So teachers, clergy, aunts, coaches, doesn't matter if you're parenting as a primary person or not. We are collectively raising a generation of children in this country. It's also not just about white kids. I learned very early when I was raising white kids that I was really writing about adults, because what adults are and are not able to say to children about race has everything to do with where we are as adults. It has much more to do with us than about getting the exact strategies correct for and with our children. And finally, this also is not just about white kids, because white silence impacts kids of color. It impacts teenagers of color, 20-somethings, college students, professionals, colleagues, who come into contact with and have to deal with white kids and white teenagers and 20-somethings and college students and professionals. So this is a multiracial conversation because it's about all of us. We are all impacted by white silence when that's going on in white family networks. Okay, so why is white silence so dangerous? I want to take two passes at this. One is a younger kid kind of version of what white silence yields, and the other is the sort of more teenager version. Okay, so here's the younger child version. We know from countless studies that children internalize racist perceptions of themselves and others by ages 3 and 4. This has been studied so much. There's so much evidence for it, we can stop studying it. We just need to start studying the strategies to address it. 3 and 4, kids, all kids, are internalizing racist perceptions of self and others. By the age of 5, children recognize that different racial groups are treated differently, and they understand something about racial social status. And by the age of 5, kids know that for the most part, they are not supposed to talk about this in front of adults. So one study that was done in a preschool over the course of a year, it was a very in-depth study, found that over and over again, kids would play with larger social messages about race, and these are messages that most adults would probably assume are going right over children's heads. And I'll just give you one example. There were countless in this amazing book. One example, and this is the researcher's language, the sociologist who did this study. She writes, "There's a white girl pulling 2 other girls, one white, one Asian, in a wagon. The wagon gets stuck, and the Asian girl jumps out to help. The white girl responds, 'No, no, you can't pull this wagon. Only white Americans can pull this wagon.' Renee has her hands on her hips, and she frowns at Ling Mei. The Asian girl tries again to lift the handle of the wagon, and Renee again insists that only white Americans are permitted to do this task." So this is a 4-year-old. She's 4. She's using white racial assumptions about who's American or not in her play, and she's doing it in a very sophisticated way. We might be tempted at this moment to think, well, oh my gosh, what are they teaching that child at home? And I joked at the College of Public Health earlier today that, like, I probably would have thought that before I actually had kids because I was a really good parent before I actually had children. We need to resist that explanation and resist it mightily, because that could be what's going on at home, but it's just as likely that's not what's going on at home, okay? That's about how this works. Adults tend to think that when kids display racist behaviors or use that racist language, that the cause is a few rogue, bad adult parent apples, right? Oh, what are those parents teaching those kids? But we have got to understand that racism is actually more like smog. Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum gives us that metaphor. Dr. Tatum says, racism is smog. We're all breathing it in every day. And so if the problem is smog, white silence is just as likely to result in that kind of wagon scenario as it is if there's an adult in the home explicitly teaching a 4-year-old that only certain kinds of Americans are actually Americans. Because white silence is basically knowing that there's toxins in the air and sending your 4-year-old out into the world without a breathing mask. They breathe in those toxins all day long. If they're a white kid, false notions of their own superiority, negative perceptions of others, and they breathe them right back out into the world. That's how smog works. And I know firsthand that smog is so very powerful. I'm sure if you're a parent, you do too. My kids have 2 moms. Neither of us are particularly gender conforming. I could tell you plenty of stories about my kids saying sexist things at home that I know they did not explicitly get from me. My absolute favorite nightmare was when my now 11-year-old, but at the time 4-year-old, remember I'm a religion scholar too, was running around the house for a couple weeks talking about God all the time and kept saying, God, he this and he that and he this. And so finally one day I just said, H, how do you know that God's a he? And my daughter said, well, because, Mama, God is a boy's name. Duh. And then she said, though, I remember exactly where she was standing because I was just like, oh. She said, anyway, Mama, God has to be a boy. Boys are better than girls. Right? Hashtag religious scholar feminist mom fail. It was like the longest Facebook therapy session of my life. And you can imagine someone overhearing that in the world being like, oh, what are those 2 lesbians teaching that girl at home? No, definitely not that. And we're not silent about gender in our home. We're not silent about sexism. That's how powerful smog is. So we've got to get serious about understanding how powerful it is. My kid was 4 when that happened. Okay, another reason silence is so very dangerous. Kids notice everything. That's what their brains are doing when they're little. So they're noticing things like, who is here in this space? Who's absent? Who's doing what work? Who's in charge? Who's never in charge? If you're living in a deeply segregated and a completely hierarchical society, that alone has all the impact it needs to have. Kids don't need any adult help making sense out of their own conclusions. If they don't see black people in leadership roles, well, African American people must not be able to be leaders. That's what their brains conclude. If they see Latino people primarily in service or custodial work, our kids' minds conclude, oh, absent a breathing mask, oh, Latino people must not be able to be teachers or can't be doctors. They just don't do that. And adults often don't even realize this is going on. We just need white silence, and the next thing you know, we know our kids have come up with their own explanations. And they aren't the ones that we would endorse if we are looking for a racially just nation state and globe. All right, so here's the teenager version of what white silence can yield. Another researcher, Mary Buchholz, spent a year doing interviews in a Northern California high school, very racially diverse school, and this was a school where they were engaging an explicitly multicultural curriculum, so this was not a place where they were trying to do white silence. And she interviewed kids of all different racial and ethnic groups. She started every interview by asking these high school students their age, their sex, gender, their grade, and their race, ethnicity. Seems like pretty straightforward stuff. Something amazingly fascinating happens. White students could not answer the last part of the question. They did fine when it was age, sex, grade, but they started squirming when it got to the race part. Students of color in the school did not squirm at the race part. I don't think there was one report in her entire study, and it was a year-long study where any student of color struggled with this question. The white kids in the school, they got to the race part, and some of them would give her ironic answers. So she describes a boy who she's been chatting with, and she said he abruptly takes on a fake British accent and says, well, I'm the whitest of the white boys. Yeah, it's very awkward. But he's kind of like mocking, celebrating his whiteness. And then other students would play ignorant or get very uncomfortable, so she describes teenagers who say things like, well, I'm white. No, you know what? My mom told me my great-grandma was Dutch. That's right, we're Dutch. I am Dutch. Or they would say, like, I don't know, I'm white? And when she pushes on this, Buchholz discovers two things. She discovers that these young people are literally not sure if saying I'm white is the same thing as saying I'm racist. And they know they don't want to be that. And the other thing is that there's a narrative in the school. They associate whiteness with, quote, cultural blandness and a lack of coolness. And sometimes this is kind of a joke when it's reported to her, but other times it's clearly very painful to them. And it's a widespread narrative in the school. This is not just the white youth that have this narrative. It's kids of color, too, in the school. And just this one basic demographic question raises all this stuff. And this is so important, because if we can imagine being at an age where, you're in high school, uncool is about the worst thing you can be. You're laughing, because probably you know that firsthand, right? I did. You're being told, in this particular context, many contexts, we celebrate diversity here. That's our value. It's a key value. Good. But everybody knows that doesn't mean celebrating your whiteness, right? But probably no adults having that conversation with you about the complexities of that. So the equation is like this. You cannot embrace your race. Everyone else gets to embrace theirs. And you're supposed to enjoy embracing your much cooler peers' race. In the meantime, what do we think is going to happen in a scenario like that? And Buchholz finds what happens is these young people are very, very resentful. They don't express their resentment towards the adults in their lives who, I think, my generation has failed them in nurturing a sort of anti-racist possibility for them as white young people. They instead start to resent the whole diversity enterprise. They don't think it's their thing, and all it does is cause them conundrums. And they start to, some of them turn quite hostile, and they turn that hostility on kids of color in the school. That's where it goes. And so everyone's been set up to fail here. This was this was like 10 years ago, this study, maybe a little bit longer, so way before this current political climate we're in. We have to get really serious about this, because there are folks in this nation right now who know that that crisis is there and are recruiting based on it, and finding that they have young people who are not otherwise inclined to certain versions of race and racism, but who are kind of ripe for the picking because they've got this vortex of resentment and they don't know who's to blame. There are folks that want to help them figure out who they should blame. And so I see this whole dialogue as an investment in both an urgent investment in raising a generation of healthy white kids. By definition, that has to mean anti-racism. If you're living in a racially unjust society, the only version of healthy that's out there for you is if you are anti-racist in your ongoing sort of life journey. It's urgent, but it's also long-term. We're not going to fix this problem overnight, but we need to get urgent like last week about fighting for our kids and for all of our kids by fighting for the kids who are sort of vulnerable in these ways. Okay. So I want to move to what it looks like to break silence. I have 4 ideas about that, but I think together we have to literally create what it looks like, because generationally we have not done this before in this country. We have not raised anti-racist white kids in this country. So these are provisional, and I hope when we have our discussion that we can talk together about strategies that we think we might need to develop. The first I want to name is that we need to create in our youth, in our children, what I call race and justice conscious schemas. And I will give you an analogy for what I mean when I say that. As I said, my kids have 2 moms, so that means they've just always known that a family can have 2 moms. As soon as they experienced a mom, even when they didn't have a word for mom, they already knew you could have multiples of them, as many as you want. So when dominant culture says to my kids, which it does, 2 girls can't get married, or you have to have a mom and a dad, when my kids hear those messages, they just experience them as strange. To them, those messages are outliers that need some sort of explanation. It never occurs to my kids that they're the outliers who somehow need to be explained to the rest of the world. And that's what schemas do. They are the deepest underlying patterns that we use to make sense of the world. They make up our deepest assumptions about what is normal, what just is. For my kids, multiple moms is just how it is. So we have got to realize that we can talk about race, naming injustice, and perhaps most importantly, the truth that people are constantly taking action against racism. Those 3 things, race, naming injustice, the truth that people are constantly taking action against racism. We need to make those 3 things part of white kids' most basic schema. We need to get it all the way embedded down in here. There's a ton of ways to do that. Early and often race talk is developmentally essential. So is teaching our kids explicitly about racism and anti-racism, not waiting till they're 13 to sit them down for a big talk. That's far too late. Don't panic if you have a 13-year-old. It's not too late. But if you've got a little one who just now, right? And most importantly, the most important ways, I think, are to get our kids in spaces where people are resisting racism together, so that they experience not only a multiracial community, but also the reality that it's a very normal and good thing to do. If you encounter racism, the most human thing you can do is challenge it. We need to get white kids through the white adult problem of oh, something racist happens. Should I engage it? I don't want my kids to ever struggle with that question. They're going to struggle with what's the best way, but man, that's further down the road of where I want them to be with that question. White silence waits until we have perfect words, waits until our kids are ready, whatever that means. I don't know what that means. Then we try and explain racism. We've lost so much developmental time by that point. Because if our kids first build a schema that's somewhere along the lines of colorblind, you're not supposed to talk about this, to explicit racism, depending on what their sort of environments and the kind of messages they get, we've got so much more dismantling to do with them than if we start really proactively as early as possible helping them develop their anti-racism skill set. And you cannot do that if you aren't having lots of conversations about race. You just can't. Okay, the second set of stories, this is about racial scripts being very, very powerful. Racial scripts like a play. You write a script. I've heard lots and lots of white parents in the course of my work talk about putting their kids in diverse environments, only to end up very disappointed that their kids could not sustain friendships with kids of color. And this is very, very common. And one of the things that I think we all need to come to terms with is that whatever our individual unique personalities or commitments or identities, All of our lives are unfolding in a larger racial story, collectively. That story began before we did. It gets rewritten every day, and for many of us in ways that we would reject, but it's being rewritten that way anyway. And so that means in that play or in that story, I've been handed a role already. So it doesn't matter who I am. I can be the nicest white person in the world. It doesn't matter if I did anti-police brutality organizing in New York in the 90s. It doesn't matter. Those things don't matter. The day after footage goes viral of an unarmed black person being killed, if I encounter an African American person in Des Moines who does not know me, I am just another white person. All of those national racial wounds, the violence, the trauma, it exists in the air between us. It mediates all of our interracial encounters with one another. And in most cases, quite frankly, it makes us rarely get beyond more than an initial encounter. There's a reason interracial friendships are so difficult and take serious commitment. Racial scripts are about that. They're about our collective racial relationships together. And they are also operative in our children's lives. We cannot expect our kids to be immune from racial scripts. It's not fair to expect them to navigate things and figure out things that adults have not yet figured out. So if my daughter, for example, who is white, both of my kids are white, if they are only taught that police are safe, if that's the only thing I ever tell my 11-year-old, go find one if you're in trouble. If that's the only thing I say, her relationship with her African American cousin, who is necessarily being taught that police are complicated for him, their friendship, their relationship is going to be impacted, period. They can cousin love each other all they want right now at ages 11 and 13. By the time 2 or 3 years from now, the depth of their friendship is going to erode, if that's the only thing I ever teach my white kid. That's how the script will play out, period. Here's a funny story about scripts. My other nephew, who is also black, attends a very racially diverse school in Des Moines, and T is a very, very smart kid, very funny. He's the kid who can brilliantly make any adult squirm, because if we were here and there's some sort of subterranean conflict happening and the elephant's in the room, he's going to find a really funny way to name the elephant and make all the adults go, oh my God, he just named the elephant. And so when he was about 5, he was one day at family dinner, we were all talking about he was talking about having played dodgeball at school that day, and he announced to my sister and I, guess what? We're not supposed to say, black kids against the white kids. So we laughed really hard because we knew that meant he had done that. But then we asked him if he knew why his teachers didn't want him to say that. And he was like, nope, they just said, don't say that. So I suspect that there was some developmental naivety in the mix when T announced this at school, apparently. But I also was clear, it was before I was writing the book, but I was clear that there was some emerging kid awareness of racial tension in the school. And he was playing with it. And I was sad that the teachers hadn't felt equipped or supported enough to explore this with those kids, because the silence that they got in response actually leaves all of those children more likely to succumb to the scripts. Those kids are going to square off as black and white, if not in dodgeball, in some other way, which is not me saying we should let kids play racially divided dodgeball. I am not an advocate of that. But the point is that those kids have been handed roles and they know it. They're starting to become aware of that. And they need adults who can help them disrupt the script. So for example, that night after dinner, I was trying to imagine what that might have looked like. And I thought, okay, well, what if a teacher had said, the teacher's thinking, oh my God, I don't know what to say. Okay, what if the teacher had just said, well, that's an interesting idea. What made you think of that? Or, what about white kids and black kids who are friends? Would they be allowed to play on each other's team if they wanted to? That would disrupt the script. Or, how do we know who's black and who's white? What about kids who have families who are black and white? Or what about students who are Latino or from Vietnam? Do they get to play? Whose team are they going to play on? That would be fascinating. Or, interesting, where else have you seen people divided up and going at each other like that? Does that happen in our school? Does it happen in Des Moines? I think that last set of questions would have elicited all kinds of information for those teachers about what's actually going on in the school, things that they do not hear about. And also would have signaled to those kids who got to have that conversation, oh, there's an adult who can handle this conversation with me. Again, I really want to be clear. I'm not suggesting we allow kids to play racially divided dodgeball. We shouldn't be dividing kids by gender either. I think that's also what he was assuming, because we do that. We shouldn't do that. But this is a great example of opportunities for an opportunity, in this case, for exploratory race and justice conscious dialogue. The thing is, adults have to stop underestimating kids, and we have to, frankly, just stop freaking out all the time. They're ready. We need to stop freaking out. All right, 2 more stories. Third story, this is about race being in our bodies. And this is an actual story from this actual mom and my actual white kid, my younger. When my child was 4, we were at Chuck E. Cheese one day, and I always tell folks, like, lesbian moms should get a pass from Chuck E. Cheese, but we don't. So if you're in question about that, just so you know, you're going to have to go there also. It's the bastion of hell, but anyway. My 4-year-old had been invited to a birthday party, so we were at Chuck E. Cheese. It was so packed because it was Sunday afternoon. It was a mostly white crowd that was there. There was a handful of, a group of African-American kids who were there together, and they were running around enjoying themselves immensely. And there was never anything vocalized that day, but it did not take very long before I could feel in my body the racial dynamics of the space. So I noticed that the white adults were giving kind of quick glances, kind of cursory glances at the kids. And they weren't like hostile glances, but there was just kind of an awareness, but then they would sort of quickly revert and not make any kind of eye contact with the kids in the space. And there was this was particularly pronounced and unnatural because the space was so crowded that you had to make eye contact with people because we were bumping into each other like all over the place. And so like if 10 of us were suddenly to walk through the door in the back right there at the same moment, the first way as humans we're going to negotiate that probably is like through eye contact. And moving our bodies to sort of defer and do that sort of positionally, that was not happening. So there was no eye contact happening between the African-American children that were in the space and the white adults. It was sort of like we were in racial bubbles, our separate racial bubbles. We can be in very integrated spaces and be completely segregated if we don't actively disrupt those bubbles. So at one point, I stepped up with my 4-year-old who wanted to play a game. At the very same moment that a child who was probably about 9 stepped up to play the same game, and consistent with how the space was, he didn't look at either one of us, but we were going to have to figure out who was going to play first. This child happened to have these really incredible designs shaved in his hair, and I stopped him and I said, hey, oh my gosh, I love your haircut. And so for a moment, he turned and he looked at me, and for a moment he seemed a little bit startled, but then he broke into a huge smile and he was like, thanks, because he clearly knew he had an amazing haircut. It was really gorgeous. And then we all made eye contact and smiled, and it was fine, great, good. And then for the next hour or so that we were at Chuck E. Cheese, this child and a couple of the kids he was with literally chased my 4-year-old around Chuck E. Cheese, and over again kept coming up to my 4-year-old, shoving tickets in their hands every time they won a game, every time they won skee-ball tickets and stuff. Like literally we left with hundreds and hundreds of tickets that day. And my 4-year-old, it was so sweet because they were so much younger, and like these big kids, you know, when you're 4 and a 9-year-old's paying attention to you, that's like, oh my God. And they're like, you know, using my child's love language, skee-ball tickets, right? So they're just like, my child is looking at me like, oh my God, you said I couldn't have all the last landfill plastic today, and I'm gonna get it, you know? And so, like, this was amazing. But it was the only interracial interaction that I saw at Chuck E. Cheese that entire time we were there. That was a constructive, explicit one, right? There was interracial interaction, but it wasn't that. And I don't know for sure. I tried to read later as I was trying to understand maybe what had happened that day, and there are some theories out there. But my hypothesis is certainly that racial divides, in this case the unexpected crossing of one, had everything to do with what was going on in that space and in that interaction that followed. I felt in my body, for my part, which is the only part I can speak about with certainty, I felt the relief of kind of getting outside of my racial bubble. Like I could feel the relief of that. And I don't know what this child had anticipated when I started to speak to him, but his smile and his exuberance afterwards suggested that something about our exchange ultimately was welcome to him. I mean, because 9-year-olds don't usually give up their Chuck E. Cheese tickets. They just don't. My 11-year-old doesn't even give them up. And I share this because it illustrates so profoundly that race is a body thing. Our bodies create racial and interracial dynamics when we're in collective space together. And without words, the ways our bodies relate to one another can increase or reduce racial tension, increase or reduce connection and engagement. And I wasn't thinking about that proactively at Chuck E. Cheese that day, and I couldn't have verbalized any of that with my 5-year-old, 4-year-old. My 4-year-old was internalizing it anyway, though, even though I couldn't have talked about that with them, because we were all embodying it. And then, because of a 9-year-old's generosity, my child experienced and participated just for a moment in the disruption of embodied racial division. So even though my child has no conscious memory of that necessarily, I know that their body, my 4-year-old's body, was impacted in a positive way like that, but developmentally significant way, but it won't last, right? We have to have those experiences over and over and over again. So that's just one example of one space, but the strategies we need to develop and be conscious about have to do with being intentional with our bodies. Being intentional about our bodies, what our children see our bodies doing, what our children's bodies do, things we don't even have words for yet. Okay, this is my last story. It's the most difficult one for me always because it's about my clarity that we have to be willing to break kids' hearts. We have to be willing to break white kids' hearts. So about two more years ago now, another mom and I were lamenting the nation's racial climate. And this mom nodded towards her young white child, I think was about 4 at the time, and said to me, "I'm just so grateful that she doesn't have to worry about any of this yet." And the thing is, I totally got it. I got what she meant. I get it still. I want to protect my children. We are living in very violent, very difficult days. And like any parent or caregiver out there, I want my kids to have all the hope they can about the world and its possibilities. We all want that for our children. But what I'm really clear about is that there is nothing innocent about white innocence. And in the face of racial injustice, I am deeply coming to understand that keeping white kids innocent actually means actively bartering away their humanity. And that I will not do with the white children in my life. So I learned this most profoundly, I think, for the first time in fall of 2016, when Terrence Crutcher and Keith Lamont Scott were both shot and killed by police in a period of like 2 weeks. And students I work with at Drake were organizing a protest, a vigil. And so I said to my 2 young children, who were 6 and 8 at the time, I said, "Do you remember when we talked about the men who were killed by police?" I said, "My students are going to have a vigil of protest, and they want to just make clear they want this to stop, and I'm going, and if you want to come with me, I'll take you. Do you want to go?" And they both said, "Yes, we want to go. Can we make signs?" And I said, "Sure, you can make signs. What are your signs going to say, actually?" And in unison, my kids said to me, "Black Lives Matter." So I said, "Great, you can make those signs, sure." So I've taken my children to protest for their whole lives, but by this point, they had gotten old enough that they were more clear about what was going on. They haven't always known quite what was going on. They chanted, and they were more fully engaged. They participated with vigor with Black people and Latino people and Asian American people, and other people of color, and a few white people who just were standing together to say, "Enough, no more, basta." And they saw these young people, amazing, being just brave and loud about their determination to be free and the value of their own lives. And they also experienced those same young people and the adults there asking them about their signs and affirming them for making their voices heard. And all of that was powerful. Of course, the most important reason it was morally powerful for us to be there, but for their development, it was also powerful because they experienced having a sense of anti-racist agency, which our kids need to experience. So that's how the story ended that day. But the middle part of the story is where I learned what it means to let white kids have their hearts broken. Because what happened was I walked downstairs where my children were making their signs to tell them it was time to go. And when I came into the room where they were making their signs, I literally lost my breath when I saw my older child's sign. H's sign said this. It was in green and red marker. It had hearts and stars all over it. And it said, Black Lives Matter, in big letters, M-A-T-E-R. It said, they matter the same as white. And then my child had written, stop killing them. And then below that, my child had written the names of people in her life who she loves. And what her sign said, her sign put it this way, it said, people that are black are, and it's B-L-A-K. And it said T, her cousin, she'd written out his name. A, her cousin, she'd written out his name. And Toby, her aunt, my sister-in-law. And as you can imagine, I did not just lose my breath. I literally felt my own heart shatter into about a bazillion pieces when I saw this sign. But what I remembered from that experience and in that day was that these are not days in which any of us dare live without a broken heart. Because in fact, if our hearts are not broken right now, we are already lost because we've already lost so much of our humanity. And so what I'm continuing to hold on to from that devastating but beautiful moment was this, that at that point, and I think it's still true, my then 8-year-old, my now 11-year-old, is a whole, wonderful, smart, kind, beautiful, and very happy child. She does not wake up every day in despair. It's much likely her moms who are doing that. But she is also, in her not quite fully old enough to fully get away, she is living with a broken heart, and she's aware of it. She understands that racism is a real thing, that it has real consequences for real people, and she knows that some of her most beloveds are among those people. She knew exactly what the stakes were in going to that protest, and at the time her heart was just still naive and young enough that she, exposed enough, she was willing to put that pain aloud right there on a sign, right? Don't worry, I of course made sure with my sister and sister-in-law that it was okay if she did that. We cleared that before I let her show up at a protest with her cousin's names on a sign. My friends, there is just so much uncharted territory here. Uncharted territory for raising white kids for racial justice. Most of us have not had models if we're white ourselves. We just haven't. This is scary work. It's loaded. It's hard. But I am very clear at this point in my life that the most truthful questions about raising white kids have to not be exactly how we map or measure our attempts to teach them about justice. The most truthful questions aren't the practical ones. Those matter, but they're not the most truthful ones about how we do it exactly right. The most truthful questions simply have to do with whether or not we'll be brave. That's the question we have to answer. Will we be brave? Raising white kids for justice requires we expose them to hard realities. There's no way around it. It requires that we create space for them to move in to their own relationship with injustice, to allow them to literally feel it, to touch it, to actually ache from its costs. And I get that that's tough because it's about letting kids' hearts get broken. But I am convinced that is the most life-affirming choice we could possibly make. Not just for the future, but actually for today. Because allowing my children and making sure my kids' hearts get broken and that mine stays broken with them, that is the only way that my 2 little white children are going to remain human enough to recognize and actually decide to fight for the humanity of their fellow humans whose lives are actually at stake in this system. And so for me, with all the uncertainty, the awkward, the tears, and the fears, we need to just be courageous and emboldened together. And we need each other, but we need to be courageous and emboldened together because the lives and the humanity of all of our children on this precious earth deserve nothing less from us. They deserve it. So we got to do it. So let's do it. Okay, let's talk about it. Thanks. Uh-oh. I don't know where it went. It's over there. So I'm going to say this. John is going to carry a mic so we make sure everyone can access hearing the questions. I am happy to engage any respectfully articulated question, insight, suspicions about, I'm not I feel like this is work we've got to figure out together. I could be wrong. I'm open to that as long as, again, be respectful as we articulate it. I know we will. And so there's not, aside from that, there's no shame, no blame, no judgment. We need to talk about these things. So John has the mic.
And as Dr. Harvey said, if you could wait for me to bring you the mic, because we are live streaming and we want your question as well as the answer on there. So if we have any questions, just shoot a hand up and I will bring you the microphone. I think you've answered everything then. No.
Perfect.
Surely someone has a question.
Let us go. Do the work.
I've got one way over here, so, and then another one behind her.
Thanks. You talked a little bit early on about, the mindsets of 3- and 4-year-olds and the impact that the smog has on them. What suggestions do you have for parents who are working with kids that young? Like, she's not at childcare, she's home with me. Mm-hmm. What should I be doing?
So there's all kinds of things that we can be doing. The first thing I'm going to say before I give a couple examples is I want to recommend to you, there's a new book out that's called, I think it's called Raising Anti-Racist for White Kids. And it's a developmental, I actually haven't looked at it closely, but it's a developmental breakdown that's really concrete from my understanding. So I'm excited to read it because in some ways, like, I lead with theory because of the work and I've sort of like come into this backwards because I'm like, oh my gosh, my 3-year-old's singing in a racist song. What do? I better figure this out. So some of the things that I know that we need to be doing are, and we can do, is, so a lot of white parents have, and this is a good start, make sure that we have lots of diversity in our media and toys and all the things, right? But we also know from studies that if you don't actually talk about that, it's not like osmosis. And so literally when our kids are tiny, starting to just name that, like talk about different color skin tones, as you're also talking about all kinds of things. There's the sky. Oh, that child has dark brown, beautiful skin. That child has peach skin. Using that language, and also naming racial categories and identities that folks have claimed for themselves. So like there's one psychologist I read who talks about like, well, here's an example, like, if we're going to talk about Doc McStuffins, you might say something like, oh, Doc McStuffins is really smart, and she has a lot of compassion, and she's African American, and she's got a stethoscope, and her, what's the dog's name? I don't know Doc McStuffins, but, and her skin is beautiful, and just starting that, when they're really young, that chatter in that language is one very concrete strategy. The other thing is I think we all, with really young children, kind of scanning our adult lives, even in contexts like Iowa, where diversity might be harder to immediately see, we still live in really diverse places. Like Des Moines is a really, really diverse city, even though it's not, Brooklyn, New York, where I moved from. And so I have to constantly think, okay, when I'm taking where do I take my kids to do stuff? Where do we live? What libraries do we go to? Where do we buy groceries? Where do we get our hair cut? How am I desegregating my life? If I desegregate my life and my kids are going along with me because I'm their primary caretaker, that also has impact. Because they also can start to then have dialogue. Like then when you're parenting, you're often dialoguing with your kid about places you go, right? And also that sort of developmental impact is really, really important. So finding ways to keep the conversation flowing is the most important thing. And the other thing is I think, and I have to sort of learn this because I like to lecture and tell people what to do, but also with our kids, like noticing when they make observations or ask questions or anything and never shushing. Always then sort of asking further questions, exploring with. This is not about giving our kids the correct answers. It's about being a critical dialogue partner on a journey with them, where like my number one goal is to keep my kids talking to me. And I know if you have teenagers, you're probably laughing at me right now because you're like, yeah, you were a really good teenager parent too before you had teenagers. But but that's because of course I care when my kids arrive and I want them to know what we say our family values are. But I also want to, most important, make sure that they know we can be engaged in a learning dialogue together. And so it's just using all the other, just like we learned how to talk to our kids about peas, nutrition, like those kinds of things, we've just got to figure out how do I talk about race and difference in this space. And young, starting to help them understand what racism is, even before they can really understand what the word is, just pointing out when racism is happening. Like, how come there's no black people in that show we just watched? I wonder why that is. Our kids, So those are some examples. You bet.
Okay, I've got one here in the
All right,
back,
John.
and then we'll get some folks up closer.
I have nieces and nephews who have children that are very young, and two of them live in northern Wisconsin, so the diversity there is very, 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 very rare. And then I have another family that live in in California, and I was wanting to know how would you suggest that I approach my niece and nephew to make this discussion with their children, because they do have cousins and that are biracial and black.
So, in part, in some ways it's a little difficult for me to sort of responsibly engage that question, because it depends a little bit on things like how close in proximity, what kind of relationship you have with your nieces and nephews, how often you see them and their kids. But so, for example, one thing I might think about is, and doing this in a way that respects the dignity and the privacy of especially the biracial kids that might be impacted by this. But, I often find, like, in family networks, starting from a place of, like, helping family members understand what people go through is actually, and sort of leading with that kind of really humanizing and relational kind of sharing can be, in some families, not all, can be really powerful. So, for example, I think in some contexts, one of the reasons that gay and lesbian issues, I'm not going to say trans because I don't think so, and by the way, this is Trans Day of Remembrance that we're here doing this work, so I just want to name that. But one of the reasons that sort of we've made quicker progress, I think, in some communities on lesbian and gay issues is because lots of us end up with lesbian and gay people in our families, and so those folks are real to us, and so we decide to get off the sidelines and get into the struggle and educate ourselves. And one of the realities of race is that segregation is so profound in this country, and the violence has been so severe that so many white folks literally don't even know actual people of color who they have meaningful relationships with, right? So the material form that injustice has taken has made it even more difficult. So I think one lead can be sort of sharing from a place of, like, wow, this is one of the things that, this person who you already love, hopefully, like, has gone through. What do you think about that? Or, like, are you talking with your kid about this so that would they know what to do to show up for their cousin if this happened? And if not, could we have a conversation about that? With my own kids who are very, very close to their cousins, my kids are white, their cousins are black, they're very good friends, and from young, I was constantly asking them, if this thing happened to your cousin, like, what would you do? How would you handle it? Like, how would you want to show up? And so that could be one way. I also, this is adjacent to your question, but one of the things I think that we can and need to realize too is, as kids are growing up, like, even in places where there's not that much diversity, talking about racism and anti-racism is a work that we can and must do no matter who's in the room, no matter what the space is. So, like, with kids, this might not be something you could do with your niece and nephew, I don't know. But, like, if I was living in a context like that, after sort of really proactive, race-conscious kind of leaning into the younger kid stuff, over time I would start engaging my kids of, like, whose land was this? And where did those folks go? And where are they now? Like, local context and, those kind of conversations. Kids can learn to have those conversations very, very young, and they need to. And also, a lot of times that means we're learning them too, because a lot of us don't actually know the context of our own local area. So that may not be a very satisfying answer, because I think some of it's really family and location specific, but those are some things I would think about. I do think having the conversation is really important and finding a way to do it.
Okay, we've got a question here.
Thank you for your talk and your book. I love the answer to the first question. I have a similar question, but for teenagers, and they actually do talk to me. And the 16-year-old is dating a beautiful black boy, and I'm just curious your advice on how to talk about race with them.
Okay, after I say this, anyone who has teenagers in the room can tell me how much I F this up. But especially if they talk to you, some of the things I might try would be like, our young people are totally aware of, even if they don't exactly read it, the news. I would start there, because they're swimming in that stuff, and this stuff is so toxic and volatile and dangerous right now. We should all be doing that anyway. That would be one. I also would ask them like, like reading sort of a variety of books by Black and brown authors for, young adult fiction together. See if they would read it together with you. Would be a great way to also, like, in a connective, relational way, invite a conversation that also gets fed with some equipping as part of the invitation. There's just so much great stuff. So if your kids would read a little bit with you, or like you separately read and then you talk about it, I think that could be an amazing way to do it. And then if you have that kind of relationship, I could imagine asking my kids, like, do you ever experience tensions at school around this relationship? Do people ever say things? If they do, what do they say? How do you handle it? How do you feel when you handle it? How do you think your boyfriend or girlfriend feels, or your significant other feels when that happens? Just sort of asking the question, and not in, and if they're like, oh, Mom, I don't, okay, cool, backing away, but just just asking the question, because it's very likely they are experiencing dynamics, and they might not, even if they talk to us, they might not know that they can lead and share that, or they might not have thought to share it. And just asking the question can sometimes invite some, again, together, critical conversation together, where you're just journeying with each other. Those would be 3 of the things I would think about trying. Yeah.
Okay, other questions? Okay, we've got a couple here, and then I'm going to make sure we hit the other side of the room.
All right, thanks, John.
Thank you. I have 2 questions. I have a 9 and 10-year-old, and I really thought that I would kind of like to have them sitting next to me, although I realize this is an adult conversation, but also it's not. It's a conversation with children. So I find that I want to talk with them, and I'm not just putting it off on experts, but I talk to them about so many, there's just so much on the plate that I would love for them to hear this in this format from someone sometimes that's other than me, that's telling them facts, and that they can just, I don't know, have their eyes a little bit brightened, or, minds sparked by somebody. They can't necessarily spend the time on it in school. Mm-hmm. And so I just want to know your thoughts on that, and if you don't mind, a second quick, easier question. Is that I teach preschool, and I'm wondering if you have a reading list for like 3, 4, 5-year-olds fiction that just would be good to have in the classroom.
Mm-hmm. So I don't have a reading list at the ready, but there's so many good lists out there. And so if you literally, I should have brought this handout. I have some resource. There's some resource in the back of the book. Like embracerace.org is a great website. Raising Race-Conscious Children is a great website, both of which have great resource lists, like for kids' books. And so that stuff is easy to find, and folks will have vetted it. We Need Diverse Books is another organization that's really clear about advocacy for diverse books in children's literature, and also vets around, good children's books, right? So those would be some of the resources I would turn to. Your 9 and 10-year-old. Can you talk to them? I can't, because they don't trust and know me. But they do trust you and know you. Yeah.
Can I jump in?
Yes, jump in.
Demand the schools talk about
Yes.
it. They should, They can and they should. And there are good things out there, but they're not going to do it until we demand it, I think.
I do agree with that. And I mean, and teachers need parents to demand it, because sometimes teachers who want to try get nervous about backlash. They need parents behind their backs to help them do that. But I also really want to encourage you. So there are also children's books that with your 9 and 10-year-old that you can engage. That there's not as many as there are for healthy sex education kinds of books. But there's a book you can get. It's called Not My Idea, a book about whiteness. It's for I read it with my 9 and 10-year-old. They didn't want to talk about it, but it's on our bedstand, my bedstand. They pick it up every now and then, and it's amazing because it's really informed developmentally by lots of the research I've drawn on, and it talks about racism in really clear ways for that age set, but also it also says as in the title, this wasn't my idea, it just sucks. And it wasn't my idea, so now what? And so it's got also a list of really powerful white anti-racist folks in history who've shown up as allies and in solidarity with black and brown people, which our kids need to know that those people have always existed as well. Not so we overstate how many there were, but our kids need to know, John Brown existed, Ann Braden existed, Heather Hayes, who was killed in Charlottesville, is that her name? Heather Hayes, who was killed in Charlottesville 2 years ago, existed, right? That people have, that might not be a 9 and 10-year-old, but there are people who have always showed up in solidarity, and that's the kind of white people we're trying to be. That would be one strategy, and that's a strategy I'm trying with my kids all the time, is okay, yeah, this stuff is hard, and it makes me feel so sad, and it's also then allows us to ask this really important question: what kind of white family do we want to be? And so we're looking to these folks who worked in accountable relationships with these folks, right? And I also would say some of the stuff in my book, once I let my older child sit through this talk, but some folks aren't ready to talk about police with their kids in quite the way I do, and that I've chosen to do with my kids, and there's judicious decisions we all have to make, but there are some of the stories in my book that I might read to your 9-year-old and be like, what would you do? I really want to encourage you. I hear you, and I also know the truth is the only thing that we have is some of us might have been thinking about it a little bit longer. I happen to have, most of us, we're in this together. So you can do it. I know you can. And if you just start offering and stumble around, our kids help us figure out where to go. And yes, we should push on the schools and support the schools.
And there's fabulous children's literature. That's also a way in.
Yeah, huge way in. I took my 11-year-old and I also just went and saw Harriet, and we had a really interesting conversation about how it compared with what she already had learned, and her observations about, and I know there's critiques out there about this, but there were at one point she used the language of race traitor about one of the figures in it, and then she was like, oh, but that white person and that, so we had a really interesting conversation about people make choices about how they show up, even if they are also part of a racial group. And so I think there's just so much out there. I think if we just just do it.
Got a question over here.
You spoke about influences that come from outside your home and that might shock you to hear your own kids saying. You gave an example. Another example I would offer that has happened in my house and that I've heard other people describe this happening in their houses with their white kids, is to say, yeah, at school it's always the black kids getting in trouble.
Yeah.
And I wonder, my kids are tween. I'm wondering if you could speak more about kind of disrupting that narrative and the ways that we can support our kids in pushing back on that.
Yeah. I would say this feels sometimes to me that one of the more urgent and also really really difficult questions, because it's a way in which the way that racism is playing out in our school contexts, again, it blows more toxins into our kids' brains. So I don't know that I have any great explicit responses to that, other than, again, my default is always to go to questions. Questions. Even if it's as basic as I wonder, why do you think that is? Why do you think that is, that keeps happening? If you ask your child that question, you're going to get a lot of information about what conclusions they're drawing. And maybe they're going to say things that are, racist and racially inflected in ways that make you uncomfortable. You want them to say that to you so you can find some ways to unpack that then. Or maybe they'll surprise you and be like, well, I think that that kid doesn't feel like the teacher likes him very much. So I would start with a question like that. I would also, depending, especially teenagers, I've watched firsthand, I was saying this earlier today, I didn't say it here, the same gorgeous nephew I have who is so frickin' smart and so funny and so engaged. I am not naive about racism. I am just astounded by even good white teachers at his school, what he comes home with in terms of his discipline stuff. Instead of seeing him as an engaged learner, he gets demerits for being disruptive, right? I would with kids sort of, if you, I use made up stories that are real with my kids a lot. And so like that's one you could use with a kid. Like, I heard this person talk at the library tonight. She told me her nephew, this happens. Does this happen at your school? You know, these kind of scenarios are a really good way to help our kids, like, again, critically engage in dialogue with us about A, what do they think's going on? B, what do they think they could do? D, can they do anything? Those would be some of the ways I might approach it, especially with younger kids. It's also another, that question's such an important piece of evidence around how critical it is that we get into the school context that we have access to, like the spheres of influence we have access to, and decide to be anti-racist actors ourselves in those spaces, so that we are sort of more proactively, and the school sort of crisis around racial disparities is thick and deep, and really there's so many layers, like this is not going to be fixed overnight. But we need to all see ourselves, if we have kids in the schools, as having an obligation to help be part of that conversation, so that we hopefully create environments where white kids are then less likely to develop negative stereotypes, because kids of color are experiencing a radical inclusion of them in a learning environment where they feel valued and seen. So yeah, that's where I would start with it. Yeah.
Any other questions from anyone? Got one over here.
Thanks for your talk.
Yeah.
So we're new to Iowa. My family came from a very white city in Northern California. And in our city, we did have a young black man killed by the police in his home after his family had called for help. And so we brought our then 4-year-old to the protests. And I appreciate you reflecting that was also your choice, because I still wonder. She still struggles with fear about the police, and that that's young for. So we did that, and I was glad to hear you say that some people choose that also for their kids. But since we've gotten here, we're actually in a much more racially diverse school here than we were in California, believe it or not. And so we thought we had been having conversations. But now that our kid is in class with many more black kids, the stuff is coming up. And she came home the other day with a word, and she didn't hear it quite right, so it came out as the H word. And she said, my friend told me that black kids can say this word, but we can't. And I said, yeah. And
your friend is right.
Right. So I know how we answered this question, but how would you? What would you say to your kid
about that word in particular?
About that exchange. Just for example, how would you answer that exchange?
I would first answer it the way you did. Say, yep, your friend is right. I might also, a lot of times with my kids, and I'm sure, like probably all the parents in this room do this with our kids, like I might ask a question that would be sort of designed to help me figure out if she had more curiosity about that. Because like she might be in a moment where she's like, okay, cool, that's the answer, that's all I need right now. But my kid, I actually had this exact conversation with my child before we went to see Harriet, because I knew that she was going to hear that word. And so, and as part of the conference, so I sort of told her a little bit about the word, and I said, this is a word you're going to hear. This is a word we never, ever, ever say. You sometimes probably hear this word in songs African-American people sometimes sing and sing this word. We do not say it because there's a really violent history behind this word. And so we just kind of talked about it. And I suspect more questions will come up. So I think I handled it basically the way it sounds like you did. I tried to give her a little more of the historical reason why for white folks to go anywhere near that word is just like forbidden in our family. And I think I made a Harry Potter analogy around Voldemort, yeah, and so just in those ways. And I suspect she's a little confused by that, and also is a little like, okay, for now, and that it will come back up. And so I think probably exactly the way you did and will continue to do would be my hunch. Yeah.
Okay, do we have any other questions? We got one over here.
Thank you. I'm actually an educator in the university. I teach art, I teach photography. And one of the practices I try to do when I'm introducing contemporary and historical photographers is primarily to start with non-white photographers, because to kind of decolonize and decanonize that space. Predominantly, my students appear to be white. And so oftentimes, I'm the person bringing forth a subject that I sometimes don't really feel very equipped to bring forth. And so that's kind of like one part of it, is sort of how to be the perception that I'm the expert on this thing that I haven't experienced and I didn't live. But I'm just trying to show difference and show different perspectives through the art medium. And the second kind of part of that is that I did have a student come to me and sort of say that they didn't feel like one of their own stories was something that felt important in light of having our class having done research on different narratives that were non-white. And so that felt really like a struggle to me. It was that kind of turning back, turning around moment that you've described that might happen when you're little or as a teenager or as an adult. And I felt really perplexed by that because I don't want to say your story isn't important because you're white or you're this gender or you appear this way. And so they ended up not doing the project that they wanted to, and that's, I think, a decision they made. But as an educator, like how to kind of make that space to say both your experience is important, but it's also important to understand this other experience. And this is probably a really long question, but it's something I've been kind of like dealing with a lot. And especially in this context, I'm new to Iowa City, and I'm from Atlanta in Midtown, which is a much different diversity that I'm kind of not used to this space. And so again, I guess like the question of like how to be perceived as the expert on diversity in like a classroom space, but also how to make space for students to feel like their story is also important, even if it isn't, if it is white, if it is cisgendered, so.
Thank you for that very vulnerable question. So one of the things that I do, I kind of have three sort of threads to how I would, I also teach, my expertise is in Christian social ethics. I teach courses on Black Christianity. And so I identify with the challenges and the really important teaching posture of being transparent about one's own social location, the ways that limits what we do. So the way I tend to move in relationship, especially the first part of your question about the sort of question about being perceived as the expert or folks thinking that you think that you're the expert, I tend to be really probably over transparent with my students about precisely that dilemma. But not in a like, okay, I can't know anything about this because I'm white kind of way, in a like, more of a critical analysis kind of way. Like, so sometimes in my class on Black Christianity, I will say like, okay, here's a real life dilemma. Our teaching faculty at Drake University is like X% Black or brown. And it's, on the one hand, that is institutional racist negligence. And at the same time, it would be educational negligence for you to leave this institution and not had robust education around all like we talk about, we're creating global citizens. How are you doing that if you are not learning an engaging curriculum where the African-American experience is centered or Latinos' experiences are centered of all their complexity and diversity? And so I kind of sort of name that, but I don't name it in a like, therefore this is okay and I can be the expert. I'm like, this is an ongoing problem that I don't know how to fix in this moment. Institutionally, I'm committed to helping change the environment, but in this moment I know like it's also doesn't work to just say, so you thus aren't going to study this stuff, right? And so I just tend to kind of share with all of my students like a lot about what goes on in my own conundrums about it. Doesn't mean I tell them everything, but like, but especially because I do ethics, I always pose it as and thus we're making do because you all deserve better actually. And especially Black and brown students deserve better. So that's sort of how I handle the expert sort of dilemma. I would probably think about, similarly with the sort of yearning around, like, I'm not getting to engage my story kind of response you might get from a white student. I would probably do a couple things. One, I would want to sort of like we do with younger children, ask a lot of questions about what's going on, because I want to value that as a teacher. I want to meet all of my students where they're at to the best of my ability, and sort of acknowledge that, like, yeah, there are times and moments where you might want your story to get center stage, and in this particular moment you're not, and I hear you that feels hard to you. And I want to invite you for a moment to look at the teaching faculty at the University of Iowa. I want to invite you right now to think about, are there spaces, what are the spaces you do get to tell your story? And sort of invite a student, and this is, especially if it's a one-on-one kind of moment, to actually do a critical scan of their environment. So to see if they can actually name that is it actually true that they never get to contend with their own story? I suspect it's not if they're a cisgendered white person. And again, not a didactic like, oh, shame on you for having that, but like, I'm interested that this feels hard to you because in my experience, I've had all of these places. So maybe I point out, like, I get to talk about my experience here. My experience is centered here. When we do orientation on Drake's campus, white students' experience is centered in these ways. Has that not been your experience? Like, kind of see if you can elicit kind of some critical reflection on that. And I often, like, in moments like that too, will just sort of acknowledge, I hear you that this feels hard to you. In this moment, I'm the teacher, and so I still I've thought long and hard about what makes an excellent curriculum in this moment, and I'm gonna, you're paying the institution for me to give you a good education in this moment. That's what this means. Those are some of the strategies I tend to use in sort of adjacent kinds of experiences. It's hard ones.
Okay, so we've got time for one final question, I think, here. So we'll come over here.
So thank you for talking about not assuming the parents are teaching kids something that they're not necessarily doing. I have a teenager with disabilities, and part of his disability is to not understand his impact on other people. Mm-hmm. And he has a lot of really challenging behaviors. And so there's a lot of stuff that he says that I have never said. And it's that part of him not understanding what he's doing to other people. And so I just wonder if you have suggestions for different kinds of learners, different way, because what you're talking about is great for a lot of people, but it's not going to approach somebody who thinks differently, sees the world differently.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I've had that question come up a few times now in recent months, which exposes in an important way like a significant gap in my own experience and knowledge. So I really don't, and I see that as a curve, like an edge that I need to grow to do this work more responsibly myself. I think maybe, I don't know, but it might be that sort of some of the resources I named earlier, who are like, this is their work. Like, I'm actually a religion scholar who just happened to like become a mom and was like, oh my God, I need to figure this out. But so there's folks who actually really like know what they're doing in this work. And okay, I did read carefully before I wrote the book, but I don't know for sure if they have resourcing around for, in response to young people who have disabilities or, sort of different ways of showing up as learners. But I would look at embracerace.org, might. I would look at Raising Race-Conscious Children, they might, because those are kind of forums where, like, that is what these folks are doing with their entire professional lives. And so their resourcing is deep and rich, and they might. And again, I just really want to appreciate the question for sort of, reminding me to continue to grow in all of these ways that I still need to grow as well. So thanks. Thank you all so much.